I'm pleased to meet a lot of you as well for the first time. So I'll just get into my presentation right away. I'd like to share a screen. I have some pictures for us to look at so that you don't have to look at my face the whole time. So very good. The title of my talk, Won't You Be My Neighbor? You'll probably will sound familiar to you, but also it's a bit of an inside joke because, as I think Emanuela was mentioning at the beginning, I'm their neighbor across the street. And so we always send these emails back from your neighbor. So we're preparing really for what is a unique Christmas. And for better or for worse, we'll probably look back at this Christmas season and remember it always. It's kind of probably we'll never experience something like this again. So my grandma, we call her Oma, she just turned 101. And I always speak with her about these sorts of things. And she's lived through a lot in her life. So she was born during the Spanish flu. She lost a brother to the Spanish flu. She lived through the Great Depression, World War II, immigrating to a new country. And she concurs also that this pandemic we're living through is something unique. And it's also been a remarkable experience for very young people as well. So I noticed this in a funny way the other day. I have a niece who's 4 years old. And a few months ago, when things were kind of a little bit looser, I saw her playing with her doll house. And she had her dolls and was putting them in different rooms. And she talks to herself, like pretends to be the different dolls and voices. And one doll was going to walk into the other room where the other dolls were. And she yells out, "No, you can't come in here," she said to the doll, "because you're not in my bubble." So kind of this is having an effect on all of us in big ways and small. But for many of us, this pandemic has been very, very hard. So of course, there's some people who have lost loved ones. Others have people who have gotten sick or have gotten sick themselves. People have lost work. We've all been forced to make different sacrifices. So as we enter this Christmas in a pandemic, things will be different. No in-person mass, no real gatherings probably with extended family or friends. So as we begin our reflection here together, I think it's important to begin by recognizing what our losses are. We need, I think, to recognize dark areas in our life before we can invite in the light of Christ. So maybe just as we begin here, start to ask yourself that question. What do you feel you have lost or will lose heading into this Christmas season? Where is your heart at this moment? What are you feeling entering this very unique COVID Christmas? So this is, again, a difficult time for many of us. In our suffering, however, we are united to the different sufferings and struggles that God's people have passed through during history. So what I do mostly is teach the Bible. And when we look at the Bible, especially the Old Testament, we see that most of the texts were either written or kind of describe times of crisis or difficulty. So when God's people went through difficult times or struggles, sufferings, they certainly cried out to God for help. We do the same during this pandemic. At the same time, we see that biblical authors who live through difficult times try to wrestle with an important question. So many of the biblical authors ask themselves this question in times of difficulty. What is God doing in the midst of this tragedy? What is God trying to teach us? So we can look at an example of this. In the Old Testament, one of the most, or perhaps the most cataclysmic event was the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonian Empire around 586 BC, and the exile that followed it. We kind of see this artistic representation on the screen. At this time, the temple, the very house of God, was destroyed by a foreign power. And so people were haunted by many troubling questions. Has God abandoned us? Was God not powerful enough to protect us? They asked themselves, where is God? And they ultimately asked, what is God trying to teach us in the midst of this struggle, this crisis? And different writers came to different conclusions. So for example, the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings probably got their final shape during the Babylonian exile by one kind of author or school. This author wrote in the exile in Babylon and tried to answer this fundamental question. What happened? Why was our nation and temple destroyed? The author of these books came to this conclusion. God was punishing us on account of the way that people, especially our leaders, violated the covenant. This crisis, in other words, was divine punishment. Other texts, however, in the Bible present different answers to the same crisis. So the prophet whose works we find in the second half of the book of Isaiah also wrote during exile and also tried to consider where God was present in the midst of crisis. This prophet did not come to the conclusion that the suffering was a punishment. In fact, he did not try to understand why they were experiencing this tragedy. Rather than focus on the past, Isaiah emphasized how God was with them in the present and what God called them to in the future. His message was one of comfort for the people. God is with us. Our suffering has value. In the midst of this tragedy, God is preparing a great act of salvation. He will soon liberate us and give us hope. Throughout the Bible, therefore, we find this pattern time and time again, whether it was the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel in 722, the destruction of the south in 586, or other terrible persecutions or tragedies. Biblical writers who lived through times of crisis and suffering sought to answer what God was trying to teach his people in the midst of these crises. So therefore, an important biblical response to times of trial and suffering is to try to discover what God is trying to teach us. So then, as we prepare to enter this COVID Christmas, this Christmas in a time of pandemic, I would like to reflect on this question. What is God perhaps trying to teach me? What is God trying to teach us in the midst of this pandemic? So my reflection this morning will be two parts. First, I will look at some aspects of the nativity stories that we find in Luke and Matthew to consider whether there are particular aspects of this Christmas message that God perhaps is trying to focus us on during this pandemic. What then does the nativity teach us in a special way during this very different Christmas? Second, I will discuss a little bit of Pope Francis's most recent encyclical or teaching document called Fratelli Tutti, which is Italian for we are all brothers or we are all brothers and sisters. So I apologize in advance. Some of this might be a repeat for some of you, but hopefully it bears repeating. In this document, Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis reflects on different challenges faced by the world that the COVID pandemic has brought to light. In this encyclical, Francis has grappled with the same questions we have been discussing. What is God trying to teach us in the midst of this pandemic? Let's begin then by first discussing some of the particular lessons we can learn from the nativity story during this pandemic Christmas. A central message of the incarnation that we celebrate at Christmas is that Jesus, in becoming one of us, has embraced the entirety of our human condition. So Jesus became one of us in all things but sin. Jesus then embraced all the good, all the wondrous aspects of our human condition, but also, and perhaps especially, he embraced our weakness and our suffering. In his birth, Jesus identified particularly with our suffering, as we're going to be discussing. This is a great sense of hope for us. Jesus suffered like one of us. He continues to accompany us in our difficulties. In the different challenges and sufferings we encountered during this COVID Christmas, we can be sure that Jesus is with us. This is particularly the case this Christmas, which perhaps more than any other we have lived through is more similar to the first Christmas. So our Archbishop here in Vancouver, Michael Miller, just released yesterday a Christmas letter, and he essentially says the same thing. Archbishop Miller writes, Christmas in the year of the pandemic bears striking similarities to the first Christmas 2,000 years ago. And the Archbishop goes on to explain, whatever difficulties this pandemic has brought to you and your loved ones, I encourage you to invite the Holy Family to accompany you in your suffering. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph know full well what you are going through. Hardship and heartache were their lot too on that first Christmas. They want to be with us today, reminding us that the Savior born that day so long ago is forever Emmanuel, God with us. So, one difficulty we experience, I think, all of us this Christmas, is the very real separation and even loneliness that we will experience at this time of social distancing. This COVID Christmas will be a socially distanced Christmas, a Christmas spent away from people and communities we care about, family, friends, our church community. In the midst of this suffering, Jesus embraces us. For the Holy Family, the first Christmas was also, we could call, a socially distanced Christmas. In both the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, we read that Mary gave birth to Jesus in Nazareth. This is a significant distance from Mary gave birth to Jesus in Bethlehem. This is a significant distance from their home in Nazareth. So in Luke chapter 2, we read the following. In those days, a decree went out from Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration and was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. All went to their own towns to be registered. Joseph also went from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of David called Bethlehem, because he was descended from the house and family of David. He went to be registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged and who was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for her to deliver her child. And she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in bands of cloth and laid him in a manger, for there was no room for them in the inn. At the first Christmas, therefore, the Holy Family, it would seem, were quite distant from family and friends. They were in Bethlehem. Their home was in Nazareth. Due to the census, an event beyond their control, they were isolated. Being in Bethlehem, they were far from their home and people they knew. More than this, even in Bethlehem, they were separated from other people. There was no room for them at the inn. At least in the inn, they would have been surrounded by other people. But Mary gave birth to Jesus and laid him in a manger, far from others, the only place they could find. As we enter this Christmas season physically separated from our parish community, it is worth considering that at the first Christmas, the Holy Family was also separated from the central location associated for them for worship, the temple. Mary, in fact, could not enter the temple with Jesus until the days of her purification was complete. So not only were Mary, Joseph, and then Jesus physically separated from family and friends, they were also separated, being in Bethlehem, from the central place of worship for them, for the temple. In the incarnation, Jesus embraces us in our weakness. As we suffer through a socially distanced Christmas, Christ is with us. He went through the same at his birth. So let's take a look at some pictures just to see, some of these sites that we're talking about here. So on this map, you see a map of Israel, Palestine. In the north, you see the red arrow pointing to Nazareth. And you see in the south, the red arrow in the bottom of your screen points to Bethlehem. Nazareth to Bethlehem is about 150 kilometers. So I plugged this into Google Maps, and this is apparently a 30-hour walk, according to Google Maps, probably more if you were pregnant like Mary. So quite a distance, 150 kilometers from their home. This is the Basilica of the Annunciation in Nazareth. So the place where we believe that the Annunciation happened, which we will hear the gospel this Sunday about the Annunciation. This is the beautiful cupola that we see. And below the cupola in the Basilica of the Annunciation in Nazareth, we find the remains of an older church that has kind of commemorated this location of the Annunciation. So we have here a nice icon of the Annunciation. And this is an altar that you find below in that chapel. And it's interesting, the words that you see there in Latin are verbum caro hic factum est, which means we're used to saying the word became flesh. So that would be verbum caro factum est. But the hic says the word became flesh here. This was the place that the word became flesh, which is quite, I think, a remarkable thing to be able to see that there. This then, going south, is Bethlehem, the the Basilica of the Nativity. And there's the famous door when you enter the Basilica of the Nativity. It's very low. Historically, it was probably so that people couldn't bring their horses into the Basilica, but now it's interpreted as a sign of humility. To visit the King of Kings, where he was born, you have to get down low. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to study in Jerusalem. And on Christmas Eve, I had the chance to go down for the midnight mass at the Basilica of the Nativity. So this is some pictures. Some of these are taken from a Franciscan friend of mine, but this is in the courtyard outside the Basilica of the Nativity, where you have a mosque across the street. This is, of course, in Palestine, in the West Bank now. This is from the Mass at the midnight Mass. This is the Latin Patriarch, Pizzaballa. This Mass is kind of interesting. On the first row in the left, you see Abbas, who's the president of the Palestinian National Authority. And it's a tradition. He always comes there. He stays for the homily. He gets up and shakes the Patriarch's hand, and then him and his entourage leave. But it's kind of a beautiful little way that they celebrate Christmas. And at the end of Mass, we processed those of us who were, the priests and some others processed underneath the basilica. There's a cave, a grotto where they believe that Jesus was born. And it's very tight, but then they had this beautiful celebration. They sang songs, and then the patriarch put this infant child Jesus down there on the, you can see, I'll get a closer picture. There's a silver star where they think Jesus was born. During this, I was like pushed back at the back of the cave. It was very, very like tight and very like, it was an interesting experience. A lot of incense, kind of warm, like a lot of singing, but it's quite beautiful. And here is the patriarch. He's putting the infant Jesus there down on the place where, because it's kind of this star underneath the altar marks the spot where they believe that Jesus was born. So that's the location there in this grotto. It's obviously been built up, but it would have been a very simple place. We believe maybe a cave where Jesus was born, again, socially distant, away from other people, family and friends, and even away from the temple, the place of worship. Let us then continue our reflection and get into maybe a more, a darker side even that we find in the Nativity story that is difficult to talk about, but is very much present and looms large. So in Matthew's gospel, the time of Jesus's birth is depicted as a time of great upheaval, suffering, and even death. So in his infancy narrative, Matthew focuses on the figure of King Herod. Around the time of Jesus's birth, the figure of Herod loomed large. Herod was a prolific builder. For example, he rebuilt the temple at the time of Jesus and built this temple on a new sacred compound, which you can see even till this day. Herod was also a vicious man. It is reported that Emperor Augustus once remarked, "It is better to be Herod's pig than his son." So this is a play on words in the Greek. Pig in Greek is his and son is huios. So this is a play on words, but also a reference to how Herod, as a Jew, would not kill a pig to eat it, but he killed many of his sons, a number of his sons. So a very vicious man. So Matthew's gospel relates the terrible detail that at the birth of Jesus, and this is what we read in Matthew's gospel, when Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they were no more. According to Matthew's gospel, then, the birth of Jesus was surrounded by death. As we enter a Christmas during a pandemic, it is hard to ignore that this Christmas is likewise steeped in death. So to date, we know something like 1,700,000 people have died from the coronavirus throughout the world. Over 300,000 of these deaths have been in the United States, where COVID, I recently read, is now the leading cause of death this year in 2020. As at Jesus's birth, today also during this Christmas, we hear this voice again in Ramah, weeping and crying out in lamentation. Rachel is weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more. In the incarnation again, Jesus embraced us in our weakness. As we live through a Christmas that is in some ways surrounded by this aspect of death, we can be sure that Jesus is with us. What is remarkable about the stories of the birth of Christ is the way in which seemingly opposite experiences and emotions are bound together. We saw that in the first Christmas, it was marked by great humility, separation from loved ones, separation from the place of worship, and ultimately this atmosphere of death. Coexisting with this, however, we find at the same time experiences of wonder and joy. Both at the start and the end of Jesus's life, we find the binding together of suffering and loneliness with joy and new life. This ultimately is the message of the cross. In Luke's gospel, immediately after the birth of Jesus, we find an expression of incredible joy and jubilation. So from Luke's gospel, in that region, there were shepherds living in the fields, keeping watch over their flock by night. Then an angel of the Lord stood before them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid, for see, I am bringing you good news of great joy for all the people. To you is born this day in the city of David a Savior who is Messiah, the Lord. This will be a sign for you. You will find a child wrapped in bands of cloth and lying in a manger." And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace among those on whom his favor rests." When the angels had left them and gone into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, "Let us go now to Bethlehem and see this thing that has taken place, which the Lord has made known to us." So they went with haste and found Mary and Joseph and the child lying in a manger. When they saw this, they made known what had been told them about the child. And all who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds told them. But Mary treasured all these things and pondered them in her heart. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all they had heard and seen, as it had been told them. At the birth of Jesus, the angels therefore proclaimed to the shepherds a message of joy and peace. At the first Christmas, so too at this COVID Christmas, no amount of sorrow can overshadow the message of joy that comes with the birth of Christ. God has become a human being, one of us, in order to be with us always, to make us a part of God's family, to establish God's kingdom of justice and peace, and to save us now and forever. John's Gospel, which has no account of the birth of Jesus, of course, we find the prologue, proclaims the same hopeful message using the image of light and darkness. At the start of John's Gospel, we read, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it." This is an incredible message of hope for us. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Today, too, in this time of pandemic, the light of Christ shines in the darkness of our situation, and the darkness does not overcome it. Light is an amazing thing. You only need a little bit of light, a flicker of light, in order to brighten up a dark room. Because of the time of year, Christmas is always a darker time, right? The days end sooner. There is more rain here in Vancouver. It's a normally dark and gloomier time at Christmas. The coming of Jesus at this time is always a reminder for us that Jesus is the light in our darkness. During this pandemic, this Christmas time is even darker than usual, but Jesus is the light in this darkness, and darkness will never overcome him. Even in the midst of this pandemic, the light of Christ is bursting into our existence. So we can ask ourselves, how is the light of Christ shining into my life now? If we have eyes to see it, there is hope all around us. So we can consider many aspects of hope at this moment. As we speak, for example, vaccines are rolling out around our country. I see this as a sign of hope. People have used their God-given talents and ingenuity to overcome a threat. The light of Christ comes to us in so many other ways. Even the fact we are able here to connect via technology as we're doing is a source of joy, a source of light. Each day, people reach out to us in small acts of kindness. These are sparks of light in our darkness. As followers of Christ, of course, we are called to be light to others, to bring hope to people around us. This is the call we have in our baptism, to be another Christ to people. I love having small nephews and nieces because they usually say kind of funny things that I can repeat in talks and homilies. So this is a more recent story. My sister was eating breakfast with her. This is the same my niece I was talking about beforehand, Charlotte. She's 4, and they were sitting there at the table eating breakfast. And my sister was drinking a cup of coffee, and my niece Charlotte is eating her cereal. And then she looks up, and she's obviously been thinking about something. And she looks up at my sister and says to her, "Mom, is Uncle Nick Jesus?" And my sister spat out her coffee, and she said, like, she's lived with me for a long time. She said, "I can assure you he is not Jesus. You can be sure of that." But the point she made is kind of like it's a deeper theological point, right? Like each one of us as baptized persons are another Christ, an extension of Jesus in the world. We are called to continue the mission of Jesus. So particularly during this time of pandemic, we are called then to be the light of Christ to other people. Another lesson I think that we are learning during this pandemic that we see in a special way in these infancy narratives is that we are discovering in a new way how interconnected we are. We know that our affections, more now than ever, affect others. Our sacrifices during this time, wearing a mask, associating with less people, benefit those around us, especially the vulnerable. On the other side of the coin, we have also seen examples about how irresponsible actions can bring about great harm to other people. A refrain we have often heard during this pandemic is, "We are all in this together." We are all in this together. As Catholics, this is an expression of what we call solidarity. Through the eyes of faith, we believe that we are all part of the same family. We are all God's children. We are all in this together. This is one of the most radical messages of the Nativity. At the birth of Jesus, all people become a part of God's family, showing we are all in this together. We heard already in Luke's gospel that the angels announced to the shepherd good news of great joy that will be for all people. It's good news for all people. This message of Jesus' birth is for all. In Matthew's gospel, we find a reconstitution of God's family to include not only the people of Israel, but all people. And this message is conveyed in a powerful way by the presence of the Magi in Matthew's nativity story. These Magi are not from the people of Israel, who up until this time were God's covenanted people. They have come from far away, the east. They come in search of a newborn king of the Jews, and they search for him in Jerusalem first, of course, and they encounter Herod. Finally, they follow the star to Bethlehem and encounter him not in a palace, but in simplicity, and they offer him their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. By emphasizing the presence of the wise men, Matthew understands that the birth of Jesus is fulfilling an important passage found at the end of Isaiah in chapter 66, Isaiah 66. In this important text, the prophet Isaiah looks forward to a time in which all nations will come to the glory of God and bring to God offerings and gifts. So Isaiah 66, all nations come to the glory of God and offer God gifts. Some of these individuals from foreign nations, we are told in Isaiah, will even serve as God's priests and Levites. Isaiah foresees a time when the promises and privileges first given to Israel will be extended to all God's people. Whereas only before Israel was God's family, in the future, all peoples will form God's family. Now, at the birth of Jesus, we read that people from other nations, represented by the Magi, have come to see the glory of God and to bring him gifts. At the birth of Jesus, all have become part of God's family. We are now forever all in this together. All are God's beloved sons and daughters. Up until this time, we have been discussing how biblical writers responded to times of suffering and challenge. In addition, as we've heard, to calling out to God for help, they also sought to determine what God was trying to reveal to them during the disrupting crisis. I have also tried to reflect on what aspects of the Christmas message God might be having us focus on during the pandemic. So I would like now to bring into our reflection some of Pope Francis's teaching in his most recent encyclical, Fratelli Tutti. So in Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis was inspired by an episode in the life of Saint Francis that, according to Pope Francis, demonstrates his openness of heart, which knew no bounds and transcended differences of origin, nationality, color, and religion. This was Francis's visit to Sultan Malik al-Kamil in Egypt. This visit, undertaken at a time of crusade, demonstrated, according to Pope Francis, the breadth and grandeur of his love, which sought to embrace all. In this meeting, Saint Francis demonstrated how to maintain one's identity when among people of different beliefs and religion. Pope Francis sees this interaction between Saint Francis and the Sultan as an example of fraternal love among all people, especially those who do not share our faith, and how we can humbly work together while avoiding hostility and conflict. Pope Francis begins this encyclical by describing what he sees to be as challenges and difficulties present in the world. These trends, he believes, have been heightened by the COVID pandemic and include the following. So, a slowing in progress towards integration, a rise in aggressive nationalism, a globalism motivated by economic concern, which imposes the culture of the powerful on the weak, a spreading sense of despair and extremism and polarization. Another trend Pope Francis recognizes is a throwaway culture in which some people live well at others' expense. People thrown away include the unborn, the elderly, the poor, minority groups subjected to racism and persecution, women who often do not possess the same dignity and rights as men, trafficked persons, refugees, and migrants who experience increased levels of xenophobia. After having articulated the various challenges and difficulties the COVID pandemic has brought to the fore, Pope Francis suggests ways in which the Holy Spirit is calling us and as individuals to respond, calling us as individuals and as society to respond to this crisis. Pope Francis uses the parable of the Good Samaritan as a lens through which to interpret and judge these challenges. Ultimately, Francis suggests that the way forward involves living a spirit of fraternity and social friendship, seeing all people as our brothers and sisters, seeing all people as our neighbors. As we saw, this was one of the messages we discovered at Jesus' birth, with the presence of the Magi. So let us take a closer look now at Pope Francis's lessons that he presents from the Good Samaritan parable. I'll begin by reading this parable. This is from Luke chapter 10, verse 25 and onwards. Just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise the Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on him. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, "Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend." Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? He said, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said, "Go and do likewise." For those of us familiar with this parable, the answer to the lawyer's question, "Who is my neighbor?" seems obvious. The answer to the question, "Who is my neighbor?" however, is a subject of lively debate throughout the Bible. Some biblical texts argue that neighbor is only members of my family, my religious community. These are the only people I need to show love to. As Francis explains in the encyclical, in earlier Jewish traditions, the imperative to love and care for others appears to have been limited to relationships between members of the same nation. This mentality, of course, is still found today. My neighbor includes only those like myself, members of the same religion, economic group, cultural group, and so forth. In answering the lawyer, however, Jesus gives a response to the question, "Who is my neighbor?" that is expansive and universal in outlook. My neighbor is everyone, especially those who are in need. In his analysis of the parable, Francis reflects on a number of lessons that he applies in the remainder of the encyclical. I'd like to just, in closing, really highlight 5 of these lessons that I find significant from the parable that Pope Francis puts his finger on. First, love of neighbor knows no boundaries. We are called to help all people. The man who fell into the hands of robbers in this parable is anonymous. Jesus calls him only a certain man. Since he's stripped of his clothes, there is no way to identify his religion or place of origin. He is simply a human being in need. Pope Francis explains that love does not care if a brother or sister in need comes from one place or another. The second lesson, belief in God and the worship of God are not enough to ensure that we are actually living in a way pleasing to God. So it's very significant in this parable that those who ignore the man in need were religious men, a priest and a Levite. This teaches us that true devotion to God opens our hearts to the needs of our brothers and sisters. In order to truly love God, we must love our neighbor, especially those in need. The third lesson, in promoting this sense of fraternity, that we are all part of God's family, the same message we learn about in the Magi story, we find, according to Pope Francis, natural allies with people outside our faith tradition, and often in places we least expect. At Jesus' time, as I mentioned, some Jews looked down upon Samaritans. Jesus' response to the lawyer is striking because it is not someone from within the Jewish community who epitomizes what it means to love one's neighbor, but an outsider. Throughout his encyclical, Pope Francis stresses the need for different religions to collaborate. We should develop a heart open to all and seek to collaborate with all. As Francis says rather provocatively, paradoxically, those who claim to be unbelievers can sometimes put God's will into practice better than believers. The fourth lesson, showing true charity to our needy brothers and sisters cannot only be a personal initiative, but must involve also an institutional or societarial response. And Pope Francis sees this in the parable, in the detail, that the Good Samaritan couldn't perform charity to this man on his own. He needed the help of this nearby inn. Charity, therefore, is not only personal, but also must be political and institutional. The final lesson then I'd like to highlight from Pope Francis from this parable is that this parable is constantly being replayed or retold in our world. And so each of us is forced to ask ourselves the question, which of the characters do I identify with? Francis sees this parable as a powerful examination of conscience. Have I turned my back on the sufferings of others? Have I become accustomed to looking the other way? The parable encourages us to choose each day to imitate the Good Samaritan. In Fratelli Tutti, then, Francis encourages us to respond to divisions, polarizations in our world with a vision of social friendship and fraternity that is universal and inclusive. We saw that this is one of the main messages of Christmas, especially with the Magi in Matthew's Gospel. Every human being is a member of the same family. We are all God's beloved brothers and sisters. Everyone is my neighbor. Now, this message that we find in the Good Samaritan appears to resonate and inspire with people today. And in conclusion, I'd like to give one piece of completely unscientific evidence to support this, that the message of the Good Samaritan, this message of universal fraternity, seeing everybody as my neighbor, is very compelling for all people, I think, today. So my evidence for this is that there's a number of recent movies about Fred Rogers, also known as Mr. Rogers, that have become extraordinarily popular in recent years. So for example, we have the 2018 documentary, Won't You Be My Neighbor, and the 2019 film, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, featuring Tom Hanks. So some time ago, before the lockdowns became so strict, I was able to watch the second movie with Madonna House, My Neighbors Across the Street, and I can say it's very good. And both these films are highly rated on Rotten Tomatoes, so very popular. Today, people then are reconnecting with Mr. Rogers' message. In it, they perhaps perceive a balm capable of healing our divided world and our wounded hearts. Many people probably are attracted to the message of Mr. Rogers, even though they were unaware that Mr. Rogers was formed as a Presbyterian minister. His whole idea of calling Mr. Neighbor's, the neighborhood, this idea of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, was in fact inspired by the parable of the Good Samaritan and the question posed by the lawyer, who is my neighbor? So the entire television program of Mr. Rogers is aimed to teach people how to be a good neighbor, how to fulfill this parable of the Good Samaritan. So therefore, perhaps it is not a stretch to suggest that in Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis has proclaimed to people of all goodwill, or all people of goodwill, has proclaimed to them the familiar refrain of Fred Rogers, won't you be my neighbor? So we'll now break into some small groups. I'm going to put these questions in the chat box as well, so you can have reference to them, but I'll just read them together. These are some questions I propose for the small groups. You can discuss what you like, but here's some suggestions. So for reflection, what are your losses this COVID Christmas? So again, as I began, recognize maybe what are those places of we need to recognize our sufferings, the darkness we might be experiencing before we can really appreciate, I think, the light of Christ that he brings us. What are we losing this COVID Christmas? Where kind of is our heart at this time? Second, what aspects of the Christmas story particularly resonate with you this year? So I was saying that, like we find in the Bible, as in this time of the pandemic, we need to ask ourselves, what is God trying to teach us maybe at this time? What aspects of the Christmas story are we encouraged to rediscover, to learn about in a new way? So is there something God is trying to teach you or all of us in the midst of this pandemic? And finally, how can you be a neighbor, or another way of putting that is the light of Christ, to people during this difficult Christmas? And how would you like people to be a neighbor to you? So thank you very much. And I will hand it over to Emanuela, or who I'm not sure.